Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Greetings, welcome again to the Right Take Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Tapson. Thanks for joining me here again at the intersection of politics and culture. There are a lot of podcasts out there to choose from. I know that. The Right Take is brand new. We're only a dozen episodes in, but I hope you're enjoying the great lineup of guests that we've brought to you so far. We've had the likes of Dinesh D'Souza, Andrew Klavan, David Horowitz, Heather McDonald, Michael Walsh, just really top caliber writers and thinkers and culture warriors that I'm honored to know and to talk with on the podcast, talking about the major cultural and political trends and threats that we're facing in this critical time in history, and how to arm yourself to fight back, how to preserve and defend our civilization, how to recover American exceptionalism and make America great again. And I hope that you will subscribe and stay tuned to The Right Take every week, because I've got many more such figures lined up, like the ones I mentioned a moment ago, including my guest today, whom I'm excited to talk with. She's a writer whose articles I've followed avidly at the Federalist, and now she's got a brilliant new book out on the totalitarian strategies of some ominous forces at work in the world. We're going to talk about the big picture of what is happening to America today, who's doing it and why, and what you and I can do about it. Those of us who just want to be left alone to enjoy our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the left won't leave us alone. They've politicized every sphere of life, and they're hell-bent, literally, on tearing everything down and fundamentally transforming our way of life into a dystopian, Orwellian nightmare. I hope that, like me, you're mad as hell about it and not going to take it anymore, as the character from the movie Network put it, and that you want to fight back. That's what the Right Take podcast is all about, keeping you informed about the cultural Marxist assault on our civilization and empowering you to push back. And that's why I've invited my very special guest today. She has a lot of critical information to share coming up next. So, as they used to say when I was a kid, back in the Stone Age, don't touch that dial. My guest today is a former intelligence analyst focusing on communist media and propaganda. She writes about society, culture, and education for the Federalist, among other outlets. I've been a big fan of her articles at the Federalist for a while now, but now her first book is out, called The Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer. Stella Morabito, welcome to the Right Take podcast.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
I've been very eager to have you on. Your book is one of just a small handful actually, of recent important works that I enthusiastically recommend to friends and colleagues, like Rod Dreher's Live Not by Lies, which is also about totalitarianism, or Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Yours is one of those, because I think it's just so full of insights about how to understand what we're facing today, what's happening to us, and what to do about it. But before we get into the book, could you fill us in on your very interesting background and how that led you to write this book?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I have had a fascination with psychological warfare or psychological manipulation. I think ever since I was a child in the schoolyard. I mean, I've always taken kind of mental notes on what's going on here. Why are they saying this and that and smearing people? And then this just kind of this fascination continued throughout college, of course, and then especially when I studied Soviet and Russian and Soviet history as a graduate student and got a master's in Russian and Soviet history, you can really see a lot of the pathologies that develop in one-party states and totalitarian systems. And then, I went on from there. And as you mentioned, I was an intelligence analyst at the CIA. I focused on propaganda and media analysis, mostly communist media. And then, in terms of my background, I took some time off to raise my children, during which I did some homeschooling. But I never lost interest in these issues. And then I started writing for the Federalist in 2014, and a lot of my articles there focus on these kind of issues: propaganda and groupthink, political correctness, and so on.
I think that background of yours in studying propaganda and totalitarianism makes you very, very qualified to talk about what's going on today. One of the quotes that leaped out at me from your book is, you say, the weaponization of loneliness drives just about everything in human affairs. That's a pretty big statement. You want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Well, sure. Yes. I think central to the weaponization of loneliness is something I call the machinery of loneliness. And, we have to start off by recognizing that as human beings, we're social creatures. We absolutely are hardwired to connect with other people. We can't survive in, severe isolation. And so that has a very strong impact on our psyches and how we behave among other people. And the flip side of that, that need for connection is the primal fear of being ostracized or socially rejected. And so when I say that it dictates everything in human affairs, what I mean is that when we feel that threat, through any kind of demonization campaign, large or small, that tends to trigger a conformity impulse in us, where we, even if we think something opposite to what's being projected with a narrative, we'll lay low, we'll tend to self-censor and not express what we really believe in order to try to fit in. And so it dictates a lot. It dictates, as I mentioned in that quote you're referring to, what we say, even what we think, and with whom we associate. And demonization campaigns are tend to be very effective in that respect. And so, this vulnerability in us, just a natural vulnerability as human beings, is very easily exploited by tyrants and totalitarians on every level.
And I think the phenomenon of cancel culture that we've become so familiar with over the last few years, that's really a prime example of what you're talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes. No, that is actually, that cancel culture really shows how far gone we are, really, after decades and decades of a lot of self-censorship due to political correctness. And self-censorship is extremely dangerous. I mean, if it just softens the ground for totalitarianism, and it always has. And then if self-censorship, if enough people do that, and fewer people are expressing what they believe and making use of free speech, which I've always said is use it or lose it. And if fewer people are doing that, then we tend to lose it. And then you tend to get top-down censorship, like this misinformation governance board thing, that the Biden administration has been pushing. So it's dangerous.
Is what we're talking about related to the social credit system that China's developing now? Is that where we're headed in America and actually in the Western world at large? A similar kind of a social credit system?
Yeah, well, I think that's a trajectory we're on. I mean, if a narrative keeps getting pushed and you're going to suffer punishments for not adhering to the narrative, for example, being canceled or losing your job or, being ostracized. When those things happen as a result, and I'm talking about political censorship. I'm not talking about necessarily other kinds, but with political censorship, which is the most damaging kind for society, where people can't express their views, then yes, you're on a trajectory, you're on a path to a social credit system, which, as your listeners may be aware of, is all about limiting, not just punishing you for wrong think, but also incentivizing wrong think. I mean, not incentivizing wrong, incentivizing compliance and conformity by in China you actually get points. It's like a scoring system where if your compliance with the narrative allows you access to goods and services and transportation. I mean, you can't even get on a bus if you have a low social credit score. And then you can get incentivized by things like allowing you to have a pet. People want to gain points in order to have that privilege, and then you can't if your score is low. So yeah, I mean it's very clear to me, and I think it should become clearer and clearer to a lot of people, who are thoughtful, that this is where we're headed, and the only way out of it, well, we can talk about that later, I guess, but is to snap out of it and learn ways to think out loud. There are all kinds of different factors that go into that. I mean, some people have a lower threshold or a higher threshold than others. Those who are already in a state of isolation, we didn't talk about that yet, but in a state of isolation because of brokenness and family and community and then all these technological kind tech meddling is the way I look at it in your real life encounters. Too much dependence on screens and so-called virtual life instead of real life. People who there's so much alienation and isolation already as a result of that. Plus, of course, COVID fast tracked so much of that by enforcing our literal isolation. But, that these things, there's a lot that we need to think about, and especially a lot we need to do to push back against where we're headed.
Yeah, I think your book is especially relevant because we just came out of 2+ years of a pandemic in which totalitarian-minded authorities just seized upon an opportunity to put certain controls on the populace and see what they could get away with. And it was shocking to me to see how many Americans just fell right in line with those restrictions and mandates. You would think that Americans, of all people, would have kind of a knee-jerk resistance to having our freedoms curtailed like that. Why didn't more of us push back? Is the conformity, the pressure to conform, is it that primal, as you put it?
Well, yes, there's that, but I think the decades of woke creep, if you can call it, in education and all of our institutions have taken their toll. And over time, we've kind of gotten used to self-censorship and complying and conforming, and we've been losing that American spirit that you're referring to, that spirit to say, "Hey, what's going on here? That's not right." I mean, 40, 50 years ago, that's what most people would have said. It wouldn't even occur to them that people would comply with something like this without asking any questions, or without being silenced by asking any questions. So yeah, I mean, we've already gone we've gone a bit of a distance down that road so that, it's really time to wake up and realize, we got to make a U-turn and regain our American spirit of resisting that kind of conformity and becoming and seeing one another more as individuals. Identity politics, it creeped in because it was under the guise of anti-discrimination and of course demonization campaigns against anybody who might question identity politics have a great effect on a lot of people, from the child who's being taught critical race theory all the way up to senators who vote for really destructive agendas, Republican senators. I mean, the same dynamic is at work. People fearful of being smeared in a demonization campaign against those who might ask a few good questions about what's going on here. So yeah, it's been we've gone too much of a distance down that road. We shouldn't have even taken a step, but that's kind of where we are, and we've got to turn this thing around.
And how does education factor into all this? You have a chapter called Cloning Lonely Puppets, the Subversion of Education. And education is kind of a big interest of my own. I'm a homeschooler as well, as you mentioned that you were. And I homeschool not only my own kids, but teenagers in our homeschooling community. So education's a big issue for me. How does that factor into all this, the indoctrination of our youth?
Oh, it has such an enormous impact. I mean, as you know, youth in particular are highly suggestible. Adults are too, but children really do depend on authorities and adults to help guide them and and develop in a healthy way. And when you have an institution of education, K-12 education, especially public education, that pushes all of these fads, no, not just fads, but just dangerous thought policing on kids. It's no longer uh, what we can call education. It's what I call coercive thought reform. And when you subject children to coercive thought reform, especially in the case of gender ideology, where at very tender ages they're prodded to question their identities and reject their bodies, it's extremely dangerous. But beyond that, the overall impact, and of course, all of that is very alienating to a child. The child, they're having their conformity impulse cultivated. It's being through these curricula, they are being prodded to get with these programs, or else they will feel or be rejected. And so that's just really scary for children. And we can see the fallout with the spiking suicide rates and depression and mental illness among children, not to mention adults, but children in particular. It's really horrible. I mean, children under 10 have had a major spike in suicide rates. So, this is all very destructive. But overall, if you just look at the big picture, not just K-12 education, but also academia, higher education, universities, after kids have gone through all that other indoctrination, it gets magnified. And then, of course, when you consider the importance of education as an institution for all of society, and you recognize that in order to be credentialed as a doctor or a lawyer or, some corporate, business schools, all of the professional schools, they've all gone woke. And so in order to get credentialed, you come out of there ready to subvert and corrupt the institutions and infiltrate all the institutions, not just the courts and legislatures, but in corporations. You got media and big tech. They're all kind of robotic in how they react to and how they propagandize, but also medicine. I mean, this is just horrific. The corruption of medicine, and then of course you've got the corruption of all of our governmental institutions, the intelligence agencies, and even the military. All kinds of infiltration, and so. This affects all of the other institutions when education is corrupted. But I want to say one more thing here, and that's that even though it's battered, the one area that has not been totally taken over because it's so decentralized is the private sphere of life. And this would be the mediating institutions, and that would include the family, the church or faith communities, as well as outside secular communities and volunteerism and real community and friendship. All of that is really the big prize after the long march through the institutions. It's these mediating institutions that have always, if you go through history, especially of totalitarian societies, those institutions are, they've got a big target on them. And so that's what we really need to become a whole lot more aware of, and nurture and protect and guard those relationships, as well as reach out and build these institutions as best we can. It's an asymmetric war at this point. You're not going to be able, through education or the media, to fight this. It has to come from this hidden sphere of life, and that's the sphere of life, the private sphere that Václav Havel talked about in his famous essay, The Power of the Powerless. Totalitarians know that our power comes from our personal relationships and the building of trust. And so when, if we can understand that and learn to, reach out and also build and protect and cultivate that sphere of life, that's the only way forward. And he talked about in his essay how that creates a ripple effect that ripples outward to the greater society. So that's what I think we need to start thinking about a whole lot more and acting on.
I'm glad you brought up the Tyrants targeting faith and family, that you actually anticipated my question about that. So I'm glad you talked a bit about that. I wanted to mention that I loved your chapter on the history of previous utopian revolutions, in which you cited a variety of examples, all the way from England's Oliver Cromwell to Mao's Cultural Revolution. And you noted that the methods and aims are essentially the same in this variety of examples. But how have globalism and modern technology, you've already touched on this a bit, but how have globalism and modern technology and social media all added a whole other threatening dimension to this weaponization of loneliness?
Yes. Thank you, Mark. What's really interesting is, as I traced these utopian revolutions, and each one had a different, I focused on a different aspect. But their goals are always the same. Even today with the globalists, the goal is some kind of utopian, almost mechanically obedient society. And the methods are the same. And I refer to these methods being the machinery of loneliness that includes identity politics, political correctness, mob agitation, even though they don't call these things identity politics and political correctness hundreds of years ago. But the French Revolution definitely had all of that, and the, Bolsheviks on up through Mao. But, what's different today, we've got the same kind of utopian goals. We can see the same kinds of methods and the patterns. But what's different today is that it's got that global scope. It's not, it's not just a region or an area like China or Russia or, England or France. I mean, it's global in scope. That's number one. Number two, it's being propelled through just explosive technological changes, especially in communications. And that's having just a huge impact on, the push to achieve this globalist utopia or whatever, what's his name, Klaus Schwab and his, company and all the, all the people who are focused on this in big pharma and big tech and so on. But the third thing that I would say is that what's different also is that it's kind of hydra headed. It's not just, there isn't one particular demagogue or person that's pushing. It's coming all over the place. There's not like one charismatic leader or anything. It's happening in all these institutions. It's happening, all over. And and whether or not I don't know how conscious they are of a lot of this. I mean, I know they know what they want, or they think they know what they want. They want to, it's all about social control and social engineering and power mongering. And that's what it's always been about. But, they all have, with a corporate CEO or the big tech titan or, they all have their own, focus, I guess, their own ambitions. It's like, I think I used the example or the analogy of kind of a Gordian knot, all twisted up and all their different intentions, but it's all over. You have to you need someone to kind of slice through that. And I think it's not going to be a quick overnight thing, but I think it's really the private sphere of life and these institutions of family and faith and true community that will get us out of that, because that's a big target, as you can tell from all the thought policing. They made it really clear that they don't want you thinking out loud. They want to control who you talk to and track you. They're really building a surveillance society, and that the private sphere wouldn't be safe from. That seems to be the goal. So, yeah, but those are the three things that I think make it different from, all these utopian radical revolutions of the past and present. Actually, we still have North Korea and all these other, people pushing in different, areas. But it's it's a fact that it's globalist in scope. It's got this high tech, arm to push it forward, and it has and it's kind of, it's hydra headed. It's not like one person leading it all, the way you had like a Mao or a Stalin or a Hitler or whatever.
We've used the word utopian a few times. I mentioned that I teach teenagers in my little homeschooling community, and the other day in a class, I had the opportunity, even though it was off topic, to explain to them why utopian visions always turn dystopian. This compulsion to engineer a perfect society, it's just inevitably totalitarian, isn't it? Always.
Oh yeah, no, there's no way around it. It's very dehumanizing, and someone who has some kind of pathology where they, so focused on power, trying to. That's why I call that one chapter on education, cloning lonely puppets. It's about atomizing us. They can't achieve, and they understand they can't get close to or approach achieving what they want without atomizing us, without um, you know isolating us against one another. That's the point that Hannah Arendt made in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Now, the idea of utopia, I do mention also that there is, for your listeners, an absolutely amazing course. I think it's taught through the teaching company, or great courses, called Utopia and Terror in the 20th Century. And the professor who put this course together, his name is Vehas Gabriel Lulevicius. He's University of Tennessee. Oh my goodness, this course is just astonishing for the connection he makes between utopia and terror. That they are they're inextricable. I mean, they absolutely are connected. And you just can't, and they cannot abide. No utopian push or revolution can abide even passive dissent. Any kind of active or passive has to be absolutely squashed. Very dehumanizing, and requires mobs and obviously, all that stuff that I call the machinery of loneliness, political correctness, identity politics, us versus them, on and on and on. It's really destructive. And at some point we got to just say, if we learn enough about these things, those of us who can have to stand up and say enough. This is dehumanizing, and it always leads to a very bad place.
One of the topics that we haven't touched on yet in your book is something I wanted to bring up. You have a chapter about the estrangement of women. Can you explain a little bit about what that chapter discusses?
Okay, well, I was tying together both identity politics and political correctness, and all of these components of the machinery of loneliness in a section of my book that I call the Vivisection of America. And in that book, in that part 2, I focus on a demographic and one of those components. And so for women, I focused on political correctness, because now I know there'll be, a lot of feminists screaming about it, but women are so much more susceptible to this reaction of fear of isolation and the conformity impulse than men tend to be. And they are so, in fact, they are so susceptible that I believe that is why the Obama campaign in 2012 picked this infographic called The Life of Julia to appeal to women, and to appeal to, it's this atomized woman who's taken care of by the daddy state, totally dependent on the daddy state from cradle to grave. And, the infographic goes through her life. And this is supposed to be very appealing to young women. And in fact, the midterm elections, there was some polling done that showed that unmarried women by a margin of something like 37 points voted Democrat, voted basically for the daddy state. So the Democrats have been courting women voters, and I believe understanding that they are a good target because they are more susceptible to the conformity impulse. I just don't think there's any getting around that. And of course, as women are being cultivated to go along with all of these agendas, whether it's for the daddy state and government dependence and being not having kids and being focused on your work and not family. And, all of these things are very alienating and create this sense of estrangement that I believe a lot of women, particularly young women, millennials today, are struggling with. And, if you look at how easily, everybody is susceptible to a certain degree, but I just think that women in particular are. And in that chapter, I use some examples like all the I don't know if you can call them protests, all the blind rage that was going on at the Capitol, not just during the nomination of confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas for the Supreme Court, but almost what was it? Almost 30 years later, the same exact scenario played out in the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. It was very interesting. The 11th hour, some woman appears. She has the uncorroborated, oh, no, he harassed me and whatever. Well, what is the point of that? I mean, why? What was that? Did they obviously would have liked to, kill his nomination, kill his confirmation, rather. But I don't believe that was the entire point of that. What they were doing was cultivating the kinds of resentments and hostilities that women who have been abused or mistreated have often felt. When they've been in that position. So what do you get? You get all the what is that, Margaret? What was that book? The all the women showing up in their
The Handmaid's Tale.
The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, so these are all the abusive women, the abused women lining up, and then screaming and just pounding on the doors of the Supreme Court building, and just really in a state of blind rage. Well, what's going on there? Well, their rage and their hostility and their anger is being cultivated. They're using Kavanaugh as kind of the fall man, the target, but really what they're doing there, I mean, in the larger picture, is it's cultivating more and more hostilities in society at large, and using this mistreatment, kind of dredging up the anger and the hurt that they've felt. And of course, they haven't done anything to deal with mistreatment. I mean, if you look at all the other agendas that are pushed by the Democrats in terms of sexual revolution, all that, they cultivate even more hurt and mistreatment, hookup culture and all that. But I just felt that just looking at the big picture of it all, using those examples, it shows just how easily, if you go back to Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, he talks about how important it is to, quote, rub resentments raw. And that's what was being done by the Democrats both times in those confirmation hearings. And of course, in every other, and so many other areas. So, and then of course you've got, in terms of race, it's the same thing, rubbing resentments raw, not moving society towards any kind of harmony, but trying to deconstruct civil society, totally deconstruct it, basically tear it to shreds, and just atomizing and, making us more and more isolated from one another and against one another.
And that's part of the utopian compulsion, isn't it? To first tear down everything, every existing institution, and Marx would have called it, I guess, the bourgeois morality. Tearing that down. It's building utopia out of the ashes of everything that came before, right? They have to start by destroying first, and then build utopia on that.
Oh yeah. No, that's definitely. And then of course, once they get a foothold, once they get power, the goal is to completely wipe away any vestige, any trace of those private relationships and the private sphere of life, the mediating institutions that protect the individual from the mass state. It's kind of the nest of hearth and home, of faith, of community. All of those things have to go, and everybody has to be isolated against one another and atomized. I mean, this is the way if you look at Mao's struggle session, the struggle session that was pushed by during the Cultural Revolution, not that long ago. Hey, it was just 1966 to 1976. A million people at least were killed just by those Red Guard mobs that he employed. But millions and millions more throughout the Cultural Revolution were murdered. But uh, the struggle session, your listeners may well be aware, the struggle session was all about uh, humiliating and beating anybody who was perceived to be an enemy of the state, or an enemy, a anti or counter revolutionary, or whatever. And you didn't have to be a counter revolutionary. All that needed to happen was somebody needed to point a finger at you, and and uh, and then you were in the hands of the mob, and they literally would encircle people and humiliate them and throw dirt and all kinds of gross substances at them, and beat them up, and it was disgusting. But it was a crazed time, and he got them all riled up, and this went on for years, and people were no one was safe from these kinds of accusations. I mean, you weren't safe as a bystander. You were expected to participate in the beatings. You were expected to participate in the humiliations and ridicule, because if you didn't, you would be considered an enemy as well. So even if the person being beaten was your family member or your friend, if you didn't want that to happen to you, then this is this is how these things come together. And it's it's a real it's just horrific to even think about. But we do have struggle sessions in the abstract already here. I mean, through cancel culture, and people being forced into confessions, false confessions, social media mobs, all that stuff. And a mob doesn't have to be a street mob, even though we have those. And just 2 years ago, with all the Antifa and BLM stuff going on. But a mob can be human resources department that polices your thoughts and your words and your pronouns and so on and so forth. It could be, academia, faculty. It could be social media. They come in different forms to enforce groupthink.
At the risk of giving away any spoilers about your book, what is the main weakness of this machinery of loneliness that you talk about, and where do we strike at that?
Well, their main weakness is free speech. When you think about it, free speech, as I've said, is use it or lose it. But free speech, when people feel able to express what they believe to others, before you know it, you can have a civil society coming together. And I think that is the main weakness. If people can overcome their fear, people especially who have the benefit of a strong private life to fall back on, they need to be the leaders in all of this to help others who aren't as fortunate become more emboldened. Others who might feel the same way, and there are many, many others who feel the same way, but they're just too scared. So when you think about it, free speech is really what allows us to have personal relationships. If we can't communicate openly with one another, and if all of our speech is being regulated and controlled, we can't develop the relationships we need to develop a strong private sphere of life. And of course, that's the idea. Prevent people from talking to one another. This is a war against conversation. This is a war against, I mean, just innocent conversation. It's a war against conversation. It's a war against human relationships, healthy human relationships. It's a war against the family, which goes back to 1848 and the Communist Manifesto proclaiming abolish the family. And we're already seeing claims that families are a form of unearned privilege, for kids, and strong families. So there's a war against family, a war against religion, of course, traditional religion, and a war against even volunteerism, even private volunteerism. I mean, in California, for example, all of the um, um, I don't think there's a single volunteer fire department left in California. And if you have volunteer fire department in your locality, I would say support them, and other kinds of productive and healthy volunteerism. It's really, this is all part of the private sphere. And so free speech, though, getting back to your direct question, is the kryptonite, I guess you could call it, for totalitarians. And that's why they are fighting so hard to suppress our speech under the guise, as always, of, hate speech, or, so on and so forth. But it's all political censorship. And it should not stand. We need to push back against that
Yeah.
hard.
Yes, and in fact, that's one of the things I love about your book is you provide a lot of examples about, or examples of tactics and strategies that people could take advantage of to wage the asymmetrical warfare that you mentioned against these big forces that are arrayed against us. Could you tell us about your experience, for example, about running what you call a propaganda awareness book club?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, Mark. Um, yeah, this is, I know this might seem like a quaint idea to people who are saying, oh, we're up against just a huge machine. But then getting back to what I'm saying, all we've got is our each other, and this has to happen, as Václav Havel said, through that private sphere of life. So one of the proposals that I have in that final chapter, which is entitled A Wrench in the Machinery of Loneliness, is the development of discussion groups about all of these dynamics, on various levels, and for various kinds of groups of people, whether it's senior centers or students or neighborhoods. But to develop discussion groups, I had a book club. There are so many. I piloted a book club a few years ago in a Washington D.C. suburb, and it was amazing how, when we discussed some of these works, there's so many good books about propaganda and loneliness and these dynamics. They just haven't all been put together. But how political correctness operates on us, and identity politics and all of that. We can glean so much from these works, and they're not just books or articles, but there's also it's like a multimedia bibliography that I'm trying to put together that includes a lot of movies and documentaries and things that we may not be aware, but we can discover these themes, the weaponization of loneliness, in those works. And so my book club met. We did about 18 meetings over the course of a year and a half. And it was just amazing how people in there just, it was like I said, pressure valves exploding in the room when people talked about their personal experiences dealing with issues like this, being afraid to say what they believed, or having somebody come out, really forceful with some woke statement, and or a child coming home from college all woke. It was really helpful, really healthy to develop the awareness of how these dynamics work and how they work on us. and how we can, we all kind of came away more emboldened by one another through this. And the other thing I'd like to add, and I'm hopeful that I could put together kind of a guidebook at some point soon in how to develop this, with a very extensive bibliography and all of that. But I think these kind of discussion groups would also be um, helpful if they included maybe like workshops on how to deal directly with uh, these kinds of situations that people are put in the workplace, in school, and wherever, to try to develop a more a more emboldened approach that would uh, challenge the wokeness around us, the all of the suppression of speech and suppression, really, of our private life and private conversations. These discussion groups in themselves can become a form of a parallel polis, a parallel kind of institution, very decentralized, very, very, spread out. It would be nice. I don't know if it's even possible, but it'd be nice if they had they'd gain the kind of strength that maybe in an underground way that Oprah's book club did, where they popped up. But she had the entire media monopoly behind her. But this would be more of a samizdat underground kind of process. Uh, but I think people are really hungering to understand how these dynamics work, and we really do need to understand them in order to fight them.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, that people are hungering to understand it, and they're also hungering for ways to fight back. And I think that's one of the great things about your book is you give people a lot of interesting options that they can actually do themselves on a kind of a local, personal level. I really like the idea of the Propaganda Awareness Book Club because I'm such a huge bibliophile. But you give people a lot of different options and ideas, which in addition to describing the problem so brilliantly. So
Thank
I
you. Yeah, no, I do say that even if you don't, you don't, there's always something that you can do locally. And, focusing, like I said, support your volunteer fire department. Make sure it isn't destroyed like they destroyed all of them in California. And there's all kinds of small ways to try to help revive civil society. And local community is where it all begins. I mean, you may know that the far left saw school board elections as low hanging fruit because the turnout tends to be very small. If they're organized enough, they could take them over, and they have in many places. So if you invest in your local community and local elections like for school board and things like that. And the other thing that I think is important is to revive comedy, real comedy, not all this fake comedy where you have late night hosts, um, just trying to make fun of or ridicule conservatives, and that's supposed to be funny. But real comedy you need to support real comedians. And another thing that I found um, important is I think it's very, very isolating that children and now even college students have such gaps in general knowledge. You've seen these man on the street interviews where people, these kids. I mean, I'm talking about people in their 20s don't even know that Europe is a continent and not a country, and they don't know. They can't name not just geography, but they don't even know what century the Civil War was fought. I mean, they don't even know which side was which in the Civil War. It's just disgraceful the gaps in knowledge, the content knowledge that's been pretty much excised from so many curricula in K-12 education, as well as college education, in my view. And just general knowledge, just standard, like, I don't know, understanding the taxonomies of, animals and, the plant kingdom. It's just little things like that. When people are deprived of that whole kaleidoscope, that whole web of knowledge, which is what you're supposed to get in elementary school, going on through high school, you're supposed to just build on that kind of knowledge. And that, has been um, destroyed in favor of indoctrination and all these woke ideologies. And if there were, and I'm thinking maybe even in the sense of kind of like a book club, kind of a casual sort of refilling those gaps would be very helpful to people. I don't know if you've ever read Patrick Deneen. He teaches at Notre Dame. He had an amazing. Well, he's talked about this a lot, but he talks about how his students. So this is in college. This is at a big time college, how they're know nothings. They just don't know. Their eyes dart if you ask them something about the Peloponnesian War or, or the Gettysburg Address. They don't know anything, but they get A's and they pass because it's all very, it's not a coordinated, they've never had like a coordinated survey of knowledge of literature, classics, history, uh, anything really. And of course, even the scientific method, as you may know, has come under attack as something like a white thing. It's unbelievable. So there's so much knowledge that has been stolen, really, from children and young adults. And if this again, I'm going back, I'm kind of rambling here, but it's a small way to um, help us get more, you know, um, regrow civil society, because lack of knowledge and ignorance, especially when it's cultivated, is very, very isolating for people. If you don't have confidence that you can understand kind of how the wider world is put together, that's very alienating. And they pretend, these kids on the street pretend like they're real cool and everything, but it's very embarrassing for them not to know this stuff. And I think if there was some kind of a general outreach, I'm not sure what form it would take, but these gaps need to be filled in, and that would really be helpful, I think, you know, in in bringing us more together and dissipating a lot of the isolation that people feel.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I think that's one of the reasons that homeschooling is so valuable and vital and necessary. This book is so brilliant. I can't recommend it enough. People, the title is The Weaponization of Loneliness: How Tyrants Stoke Our Fear of Isolation to Silence, Divide, and Conquer, by Stella Morabito. Stella, please tell me you have another book in the works.
Well, I'm hopeful that I can put together a guidebook for starting these kinds of discussion groups and book clubs and multimedia bibliography. So that's my hope for the next project, and well, I'm actually kind of working on it now. So,
And where can people follow you and your articles?
okay, well, I have a blog. I have a personal blog that is not, I need to, post more frequently on it, but it's stellamorabito.net, all one word, stellamorabito.net. And you can also find all of my Federalist essays if you just go to the federalist.com/author/Stella Morabito, one word. And of course, you can order The Weaponization of Loneliness, my new book, on Amazon. There's a Kindle edition now available. You can also get it at Barnes & Noble and I think Goodreads, just online booksellers.
Yes, and I really urge people to read it. It is a must-read. Stella Morabito, thank you for coming to the Right Take podcast. Please come back anytime.
Thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed it.
The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.